Thank you for coming this evening. I'm going to show about 45 images that covers 1988 when I moved to New Delhi from Bangkok, Thailand, and the pictures go to May of 2013. I'll spend a few seconds on each and explain the context and the time and period and the reason that they've been chosen. It was an interesting time for me to move to New Delhi. It was the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Army was occupying Afghanistan. Pakistan was under martial law, as was Bangladesh. A civil war was starting in Sri Lanka, and an insurgency was just beginning in Kashmir along the Pakistan-India border. So while it's not the India today that you may have visited as a tourist, it certainly was a very interesting place to be as a professional. And for Time magazine, I worked with various writers covering those 6 countries, and rarely did I spend any time at home in New Delhi. I was single at the time. Journalism is not the most favorable profession for domestic tranquility. So I spent a lot of time at embassies getting visas, and in particular, Afghanistan was prohibited going to legally. In Kabul, they were not issuing visas for many years, and when I arrived, they started to issue visas for Kabul. The Soviets had an embassy in India that took over for the Afghans, and gradually we were able to make flights. It's a 2-hour flight from New Delhi to Kabul. And I figured that this was going to be the new chapter of the coverage of the jihad. Many of you were aware that the Mujahideen were funded by the CIA, Saudi Arabia, and the intelligence agency in Pakistan. So it was an interesting time. There's a lot of information that I'm going to be putting out there, but I think from the beginning to the end, you will see a cycle of events, and particularly now that April 5th will be the election for Afghanistan. It's entering another stage as troops start to leave. This image is from May of 1988. It shows an Afghan soldier giving a flag of friendship to a Soviet tank driver. And in context, at this point in 1988, the Soviets had killed 1 million Afghans, which is a lot of people. They had also displaced 6 million refugees, 4 million for Iran and 2 million to Pakistan. So this flag of friendship is really quite ambiguous in the sense that, were they happy to be doing this? They're certainly happy to be seeing the Soviets leaving, but at the same time, the Mujahideen are attacking Kabul on a regular basis with rockets. In 1989, the Mujahideen tried to establish a provincial capital in eastern Afghanistan. This is a picture from Jalalabad in Nangarhar province. It was the CIA and the ISI, which is Pakistan's intelligence agency, attempt to establish a capital in the eastern part of the country. The battle went on for 6 months. It failed. And in this picture, you'll see all the Afghans that are congregating, taking this pickup truck to the front line. Osama bin Laden and the Arab Afghans were probably 2 miles from this picture. It was never advisable to be anywhere closer to them. You may have heard of the expression carpet bombing. It's a phrase that never brings on any favorable or positive aspects of during war. But you can see a plane has dropped numerous bombs in a line, and this was one of the disadvantages of getting too close to a front line. But this is also during the attack on Jalalabad. These are refugees fleeing the area. Back in Kabul in 1990, the military academy was still holding parades once a year. This is the equivalent of West Point. And it's an institution that was established long ago. The training was serious, the discipline was strong, and there was an esprit de corps that was gradually shattered as the Mujahideen were getting closer and closer to strangling Kabul. And eventually all of these people fled. In 1991, Along the Pakistan-Afghan border, this is Pakistan. This is a place in Khost province. The Mujahideen were able to establish, finally, a foothold inside Afghanistan. And this is a destroyed Russian Antonov airplane. These Mujahideen fighters belong to the warlord who controlled this area, Jalal-ad-Din Haqqani. Now, this area is part of his tribe, runs and owns and is involved fully with the government of Afghanistan, although they also are a strategic asset for Pakistan. He still is alive. In this picture, I went across with an Australian journalist looking for proof that he was training Kashmiri militants who were then going back through Pakistan and into India to fight. He was also Osama bin Laden's main ally in Afghanistan, and he is one of the originators of funding for global jihad. In the early 80s, he went to the Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia, Jeddah, and Mecca, to raise money for global jihad, and he agreed to sit for this picture. He also agreed that he was training Kashmiris. He was not shy about it, and he's now rumored to be in Karachi, Pakistan, in a nursing home. But the U.S. has killed any number of his family, particularly his two sons, and now two other sons are running the organization. They are responsible for a lot of the suicide attacks which you've been hearing about recently. This is the backside of a bin Laden and Haqqani training camp. He had numerous camps throughout this area in Khost province in southeastern Afghanistan. And it was built with Osama bin Laden's construction equipment. We were escorted through here. Pictures were not really allowed, but this is also one of the training camps that Bill Clinton rocketed after the U.S. embassies were attacked in Africa. It's still there, and it's now prohibitive to go there. Very unsafe. Part of Al-Qaeda was trained in this area. This is an Arab training Afghan fighters in Khost. It's in 1991. It's part of the trip that I made several times into this area. We had access. They didn't care that we were Americans. They really didn't understand the whole journalism process. But at this point in time, it would be impossible to go there. One of the interesting groups that we did come across are these Chinese Uyghurs. They're Chinese Muslims from northwestern China. They were claiming to be the sons of a family in Pakistan that had a Chinese restaurant, but the reporter I was with spoke fluent Mandarin, and really that's not what we believed. They are still being trained in Afghanistan, much to the chagrin of the Chinese. But these are some of the fighters that still are working in and around the camp run by this man, started by this man. I call him the Don Corleone of Afghanistan. So daily life in Kabul was still going on in 1991-92. This was a typical scene in the Mughal Gardens in downtown Kabul. Friday afternoons were picnic days. It's the traditional Islamic day of rest. And this is a dance called the Atan. It's a traditional folk dance. There is a harmonium and a tabla player off on the right. And the gardens, the park is still beautiful. It's a 16th century park, quite stunning. These are beautiful almond trees. And it's a great place to go. It also became a front line in 1992. In March of 92, the Mujahideen were getting closer and closer to Kabul. This is a picture of a newspaper hawker. At that time, there was only one radio, one television station in Afghanistan, and there was also one communist daily newspaper. This is it. And this is a person, literacy is a big issue in Afghanistan. And very often, some of you may be familiar in developing countries, if one person can read, they'll be congregating around him as he reads the daily paper, since everyone else is illiterate. In April of 1992, the communist government that the Soviets had left in power began to splinter, shatter, and people began to desert the government in Kabul. In particular, the big defection at that point in April of 1992 was this Minister of Defense, General Rashid Dostum. He's an ethnic Uzbek, and when he defected, that was the signal to us to make sure we got into Kabul before it fell. So in April 10th, this picture was taken. This is the charismatic leader, Ahmad Shah Massoud, an ethnic Tajik. So here you have an Ismaili. Afghanistan is essentially a country of ethnic groups. It's really not a formal country. You can divide it into Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Ismailis, Hazaras, and essentially they are running their own territory, even though it does have a central government. But this is one of the few times you're able to see all these ethnic groups together. The majority ethnic population are the Pashtuns, and they are not in this picture. They're the ones that are supported by the CIA, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, and they did not agree to attend this meeting. So it's 2 weeks away from the city falling. This is a press conference given by Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ismailis, Uzbeks, Tajiks. There's another defected general back here trying to come forward, but this was just to tell the press what intersections, which institutions, what parts of the city they were planning to take control of, and it happened in 2 weeks. This is the front line in Kabul on April 23rd, 1992, when Kabul fell to the Mujahideen. These are ethnic Uzbek fighters keeping out the Pashtuns. And what happened immediately thereafter, a civil war set in between the Pashtuns, who refused to take power with the other ethnic groups. They're supported by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And strangely enough, the United States continued to support them. At this point in time, the United States had closed the embassy. They lowered their flag in January of 1991 and left. And it turns out it was one of the biggest blunders that they could have made, really, in leaving the region. It sent a signal that the Arabs, anybody who came there to learn how to fight and take over, would no longer have to leave due to the pressure of the United States. This is a very short-lived victory celebration. So the Civil War starts immediately in 1992. This is a picture from 1993. An injured civilian trying to go to the market is trapped between crossfires between opposing groups in downtown Kabul. This is a typical scene of a government tank going through downtown. This is the Ministry of Defense, which became the target for all the rockets that came into the city. 30 to 40,000 people were killed in the Civil War, mostly due to rocket fire. So the burden of any conflict falls usually on the civilian population. And when I edited the film to go into the book, I noticed very closely that this is what people take when they have to flee quickly. And this is a family in downtown Kabul that's fleeing artillery fire between opposing Mujahideen groups. A bicycle, a teacup, a chicken, the mother, the daughter-in-law, and a bag of food. There are no men here of fighting age. They're all out fighting for their different factions. The main faction run by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, he's a Hizb-e Islami Mujahideen group leader and Pakistan's ally in this fight, often cut the supply line from the Khyber Pass in Pakistan into Kabul, cutting fuel and food and medical supplies. So this is what it was like to try to get to work with a taxi on black market gasoline. You can see there's no public transport, and there are over 25 people trying to take this car. It's an old Russian Volga. Again, the burden falls on the families. This is a woman with her 6 children whose husband has died. Downtown Kabul, this is the front line in 1994. At this end of the main business district, which has now been totally rebuilt, we have Al-Qaeda, Pakistan fighters, Afghan fighters, and this is the government side during a ceasefire in the fighting in downtown Kabul, which was virtually destroyed and has now been completely rebuilt. So during one of these ceasefires, I went down with a reporter and was talking to this group of jihadi fighters at the front line, not far from this picture, when another group came up to them and started arguing about a television that this group had purportedly stolen from the other group. And the argument was decided by lowering the rifle and shooting this guy in the stomach. So I could see things were getting heated and went up to the first floor to take other pictures. In 1993, I was walking around western Kabul and came across all these bodies that had been captured. These men are part of a Shia group, a militia, that were captured and executed. There was a massacre of about 800 people in this part of western Kabul. Somehow, to this day, I still don't know who was with me, other than they are all from the same group. They were captured and executed most likely by Sunni groups in a battle to control this part of western Kabul. There's a human rights case still in The Hague and in Geneva. So in 1996, this is the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban. In October of 1996, these are two Taliban fighters firing a rocket at the forces of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Minister of Defense, and the government that was overthrown in 1996. This is a Taliban mullah broadcasting over a megaphone what is now going to be the operating rules in Kabul. Men will grow beards, schools will be closed, women will not go out unescorted, there'll be no music, there'll be no movie theaters, prayer 5 times a day, shops will close, and justice will be severe. This is the beginning of Taliban control over the entire part of Afghanistan. He's an ethnic Kandahari, a Pashtun. Kabul is primarily dominated by Tajiks and Pashtuns, and while they speak with a different accent, Kabul people do not like Kandahari, so again you have this hatred and dislike due to the region that people come from. And it's also very strange that the people, while they wanted peace from all the fighting that had gone on, they pretty soon regretted letting the Taliban come to power. It also became very difficult for us as journalists to work there, as photography was also prohibited. This is what the Taliban did on their way into Kabul and destroying a science lab at a university. In 1997, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, remember Al-Qaeda is still in residence in Afghanistan. They never left. Although bin Laden took off for Sudan in 1996, a lot of Arabs remained. In Mazar-e-Sharif, which is in the northwestern part of the country, very famous for its blue mosque, here you have an ethnic Uzbek and their arch enemies, the Pashtuns, coming to an agreement for the Taliban to come into Mazar-e-Sharif. It's a town very near the Uzbekistan border. For him, General Malik, he's a former Air Force general, ceding power to the Taliban. This is the Taliban's Minister of the Interior. It's a very odd treaty that was made, and once the Taliban tried to implement their one rule, which Afghans never listened to, he wanted to take away their weapons. Pandemonium broke out. So a group of journalists, myself included, were able to get one of the last flights into Mazar-e-Sharif. It's also part of the old Silk Route. So up in the Central Asian part of Afghanistan, you can see Uzbeks cannot have trouble growing beards. Pashtuns have no trouble growing beards. So they're traditional enemies. And the peace broke down in 36 hours. And this is how it broke down. The locals, once they tried to disarm all the locals, this is a Taliban fighter. A group of Taliban, about 100, were sucked into an area on the road out to the airport. And 3 journalists, myself included, were there to watch this. This is right at the point that this soldier has been hit. You can see the brass shells flying out of his machine gun. He's thrown back, And everybody, including the two other journalists I was with, were stunned. We really didn't know what was going on. But firing is coming in from all of the rooftops into this area. So he's been hit. He's thrown back about 10 feet. Goes down. There he is in this position. I slowly pulled back. All pandemonium started. He's carried out by his friend, this fellow sitting on the side. And then 800 Taliban were slaughtered. So we were stuck in this area for a day and a half, couldn't get out. All of the Taliban that came up to Mazar-i-Sharif were killed in 1997. They were not happy. They came back in 1998 and killed 2,000 local people. In 2001, we moved ahead. This is 1997. This is February in 2001. There was a severe drought in the western part of the country. I was working with the New York Times then. I went with a reporter to a refugee camp where the Taliban had denied UN assistance, particularly medical and shelter materials. This is a baby that succumbed to probably pneumonia in February of 2001. It's 7 months from 9/11. So at the time, in 2001, things were not going well for the Taliban. And in particular, Osama bin Laden had come back. This is a picture of the funeral cortege. This is the same baby being carried to the cemetery. And this is the refugee camp outside of Herat, which is in western Afghanistan. This is the father. Again, 7 months from 9/11. Something was going on. You knew that this rather unstable country would not last long. In May of 2001, I went with an Australian journalist up to visit Ahmad Shah Massoud, who had the remaining 10% control of Afghanistan. 90% was controlled by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And this picture is taken in Badakhshan, which is part of the upper region of the Hindu Kush, near the Tajikistan border. It turns out that Ahmad Shah Massoud, with his 10%, also controlled the only functioning lapis lazuli mine, which is a semi-precious blue stone, and also 2 emerald mines. So he was able to get stones out, smuggle them to Dubai, and he was also receiving money from Iran and Russia. So he's a Sunni, even though the Iranians are Shia primarily. It gets into this whole historical period and something called the Great Game, which some of you may have heard about. But he is very aware that in Kandahar, the seat of Taliban power, something is going on. He has spies in Kandahar where bin Laden is holed up. And this picture taken in May of 2001 is 4 months away from 9/11. He knew something was going on. The CIA had refused, due to Pakistani pressure, to support this ethnic Tajik. He was very upset, frustrated. He had control of just 10% of the country, and he was assassinated on September 9th of 2001 by 2 Arabs posing as journalists in this house. 2 days later, we had 9/11, after he was assassinated. It was all part of a plan. In November of 2001, 20 journalists and I received visas from the Taliban. This is a picture from downtown Kandahar. It was the last holdout city. They had left Kabul. All the Arabs were fleeing towards Pakistan, and the Taliban gave a bunch of journalists visas to show the damage that the U.S. Air Force had done, in particular buildings and a civilian population outside of Kandahar. This is a bombed village. This is the shepherd calling his children in from the pastures to bring the goats and the sheep. It's also the cover of the book. But it was proof, according to the Americans, that because this village had no electricity, why were all these lights from vehicles and generators all of a sudden 20 miles from Kandahar city? The American Air Force figured that these must be Taliban and Al-Qaeda, so they bombed the village. We were shown 17 fresh graves. not knowing who was in them, whether it was Afghans or Arabs, but there's a good chance that a lot of civilians were killed. In December of 2001, working with the New York Times, a reporter and I came across a prison outside of Kabul, and these are 4 Pakistani militants who had been trained at a mosque in western Pakistan. They're from a group that's still alive and supported by Osama bin Laden called Jaish-Mohammed. They were captured trying to flee Kabul once the Americans started coming into the country in October of 2001. This is a picture from December 2001. They were sent back to Pakistan. Many of you may be familiar with a place called Tora Bora, which in December of 2001 was the last holdout of Osama bin Laden in the mountains at 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet. He left Afghanistan for Pakistan, and behind he left a group of 15 jihadis, Al-Qaeda, and this is a Saudi or a Yemeni soldier who they negotiated a truce with the people remaining up in the mountains, and they're probably the first visitors to Guantanamo. There's another one coming out. These are Afghans, and they were most likely sold. This is the way things were done. Americans came in with a lot of $100 bills. This begins the 4th chapter in the American occupation with NATO in March of 2002. This is a dead Taliban. This is a U.S. Army soldier from the 10th Mountain Division from New York State. You can see here 2 sets of rubber gloves, which I found very strange. I also found it very strange that his fingertips were blued for fingerprinting. So a forensic team had come through here. There was a big battle in Shahi Kot Valley where a lot of killed Americans were fighting Al-Qaeda at 5,500 feet. It's extremely difficult to operate at this altitude. Another priority for me in this book, which really didn't pan out completely, was to show the sanctuary that the Taliban had, particularly in Pakistan. These are Afghans in western Pakistan, in Baluchistan, the capital Quetta, where they would take winter refuge, and then once the snows melted, they would go back to Afghanistan and fight. And any insurgency that has access to sanctuary will be almost impossible to wipe out. And that's what happened with General Petraeus and Stanley McChrystal, the 2 final generals involved in Afghanistan. They realized that this would not move forward, particularly because of the sanctuary that these Afghans had in Pakistan. By the way, you can see this kind of dress, a very conservative Islamic sect known as the Salafis. These also have very distinct facial differences from the local population, and they knew that I knew who they were. 2006, this is a very remote area where 3 U.S. Army soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division were wounded in an ambush in Nuristan province. It's one of the most remote and difficult terrain provinces in the country. This is a Black Hawk helicopter that's come to take them out. They were ambushed while going up this trail to resupply a base. And this particular base in Kamdesh was abandoned after it was attacked. Why you would want a base down at the bottom of a riverbed in Afghanistan where people are traditionally firing at you from higher altitudes is beyond me. But I was offered another trip back to this region, which I refused. Some of the personalities that come through in the 25 years that I've worked there. This is Zalmay Khalilzad. He's the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. This is a picture taken in Kandahar, which was an airport built in 1950s by USAID. And Khalilzad, who is an ethnic Afghan, moved to the States when he was 15 years old. He was also the ambassador to Iraq. And here he's being escorted by 2 contracting security men from DynCorp. He's in Kandahar to cut a ribbon on an aid project. This gives you an idea of the terrain in Kunar province. This is in the heart of the Hindu Kush. It's a mountain range which goes up to 10,000 feet. Extremely difficult terrain, particularly to try to keep ahead of these Marines wearing 40 to 50 pounds of equipment. This is a base in Asadabad. This is the Kunar River. Many of you know who this is. President Hamid Karzai at a press conference in 2009. This is an image which really reflects for me what we're leaving behind, our legacy in Afghanistan. This is a small provincial police station about a 6-hour drive from Kabul in Gardez. Now on the side here, there were 11 brand new Ford pickup trucks, but no gasoline. The gasoline that comes from Kabul, as well as spare parts, spark plugs, brake pads, any kind of air filters, whatever they needed, would usually be stolen on the way down. So the gasoline never reached the smaller bases. These are Afghan national policemen who are inviting me in for breakfast. Their dirty socks, a HESCO wall, a flag, a Chinese or a Russian Jeep top, a broken chair, another HESCO wall, and an unused traffic cone. So this is essentially what we're leaving behind. And while it's not completely fair to say that this represents the legacy of our 13 years involvement in Afghanistan, this is pretty much the line of defense in an area that's 80% controlled by Taliban right now. Two hours away from Kabul, this is a US soldier talking to a local teenager in Wardak province. It's a very unruly part of Afghanistan. You can see by the terrain, it's not a pleasant place to be. And I can just imagine, or you can perhaps, what's going on in both of their minds where they don't speak a common language. The threat of ambush here is constant. Again, back to the terrain. This is a picture from southern Helmand province, down at sea level. This is about 5,000 feet. This is about 6,000 feet. So you go all the way down to sea level. It's 125 degrees. These are US Marines at a base and a 15th century fort. What happened during 2009 when President Obama sent in 20 to 30,000 soldiers and Marines, this represents the surge. This is a Taliban-controlled area. They're not anywhere near at the moment, but this is a picture from a patrol, a 4-hour patrol that I was on, and an interesting thing happened. This picture was published in the New York Times, and a sergeant major in the Pentagon relayed to the battalion commander that he was very unhappy with this particular picture, that there were 2 men out of uniform and that they should be punished. Well, Marines and Army wear do-rags on their head to keep the sweat from pouring down into their eyes. And this picture, while it was supposed to get these men into trouble, really didn't, but it gives you an idea of somebody sitting at the Pentagon in an air-conditioned office, what he takes to be his control and power to tell people 8,000 miles away how they should be dressed. Again, back to the terrain. This is the Hindu Kush at 7,000 feet, taken from a helicopter. Back to the same fort at sea level. So you can see the variety of terrain and how much geography plays a role in Afghanistan. This is a bomb searching unit looking at a farm for fertilizer that is easily made into IEDs. In 2013, I was given access to an airport where they launched reconnaissance drones. These are vehicles being prepared for withdrawal. Again, back in 2013, this is where they collected these very expensive MRAP vehicles, heavily armored, 15-ton vehicles, being stripped down. This army soldier is looking for ammunition that may have slipped down into some of the crevices. This is at Bagram Air Base in central Afghanistan. This is present-day Kabul. Takes on the look of Dubai and parts of the Middle East. This is a wedding hall. A view of very densely populated Kabul in the western part of the city. The bodies that I showed you that were executed bodies were taken over here. This is Kabul University. It's about the only green area left, other than this farming area, which will soon disappear. This is the Kabul River. On my last day in 2013, 6 Americans and 10 Afghans were killed in a suicide car bombing. This was a Chevrolet Suburban vehicle carrying 4 U.S. Army and contracting teachers. Mentors for the Afghan National Army were rammed by a car packed with explosives. If you can imagine, this was a Chevrolet Suburban. This is the actual withdrawal taking place in May of 2013 at Bagram Air Base. Men going out without weapons, men coming in to finish their deployment. This is an enormous air base called Bagram. There have been a lot of positive developments since 2001, 2002, and this is a girls' school in western Kabul taken in May of 2013. Literacy is a big issue in Afghanistan, and it's improved. This is the final picture and actually represents, for me, what Afghanistan wants to become. This is a market in western Kabul, gridlock traffic, markets that are open, buzzing, noisy, polluted, but people are employed and there's no violence. This is their hope, and it's also mine, really, that they will be able to live in peace. I think at this point we'll pass the microphones around and we'll take some questions. I'll be happy to answer anything or about any particular image, photography, journalism, whatever you'd like to ask.
You've covered a lot of different players which come into Afghanistan, you know, Shia, Sunni, United States, Iran, Soviet Union or Russia. But I'd like you to comment on, you know, there's a proxy war goes between India and Pakistan, which happens in Afghanistan. Would you like to
Yes. You're getting into some very murky territory here, you know.
Okay.
But it's all related. Thank you for asking that. That's actually very important. You may remember when I moved to this area that the insurgency in Kashmir was about to begin, which officially did in 1989, and the weapons that showed up in India in Kashmir came from Afghanistan. The warlord Jalaluddin Haqqani was training Kashmiris at the behest of the Pakistanis. So in order to understand this region, all these countries are integrated. They were part of the former British Empire, and when they split up in 1947, it didn't mean peace and equality in each one of those countries. So the enmity deeply felt between India and Pakistan is being played out in Afghanistan. It's also being played out in Bombay when they took over the hotel by Lashkar-e-Toiba and killed over 150 people. It's still being played out, and in particular, Pakistan does not want India to come into Afghanistan. Now, Indians and Afghans get along famously. They love Bollywood movies. They really don't like Afghans don't like dealing with Pakistanis because they're constantly being controlled by them. That's their only access to the sea, and the Saudis and everyone else does their nefarious spreading of Wahhabism through Pakistan into Afghanistan. So this is a complicated answer to your question, but yes. In order to understand Afghanistan, you have to understand Pakistan. And this is a learning curve that I had when I moved there. In order to understand Pakistan, you have to understand India. So what soldier or Marine can go there and say they understand Afghanistan without understanding those other two countries? Pretty much we've thrown up our hands and say we're out of there. And that's often what really drove the Soviets out as well. They realized that they wouldn't be able to control this region. So yes, the great game continues.
Different direction around them, as well as having ethnic groups within the country all fighting each other. We're getting ready to have an election there now. If they elect a leader, who's he going to be leading? I mean, who's going to follow him?
There are too many factors really involved for any one political party to come into power with the agreement of all the other parties within Afghanistan. Plus, every country around the region has an interest, and they're all very good card players. Iran is a big player in Afghanistan, and in 2003, when the US Army and NATO went into Baghdad, Iran was surrounded with us in Iraq and us in Afghanistan. So the Iranians are very concerned about our presence in Afghanistan, and will do anything to destabilize it if we're there. They're also, Afghans don't like to be controlled by anyone. And it's basically the ethnic groups which determine the future and the power structure inside Afghanistan. The Uzbeks want to control themselves. They don't want Pashtuns or Tajiks coming into their area. And that's pretty much how the region is governed locally.
Thank you. My grandfather was in, it used to be India, but on the Khyber Pass at the turn of the last century, and things don't seem to have changed that much. What's your long-term prediction? Do you think it will ever be resolved, or is it just going to rumble on forever?
Well, Churchill in 1898 went there as a young journalist. He thought it was absolute madness to try to think you could control that region. In 1898, it started. It's a difficult region to think you can control. But it's going to rumble on. Certain provinces will fall to the Taliban, or tribal warlords will take power for power and economic sake. The heroin trade is flourishing. It's over $200 million a year. Just opium and heroin alone. So those particular provinces along the Afghan-Pakistan border will probably fall. Kabul really won't have the expertise or the manpower to control that. But if that's the de facto way that peace is brought into the country, so be it. It's difficult to say there's a positive outcome, particularly with all the groups that are fighting for power right now, and you have an election in 3 days. Questions? Come down.
Say, when photography was prohibited, how were you able to take the photos that you had?
Well, it all depended on the foreign ministry guide that we were given, if he was conservative or more open-minded. And you had to work with a guide given to you by the Taliban through the foreign ministry. And we tested them. You'd give them a wish list, and you would try to take innocuous pictures and just see what their reaction was, particularly of people and particularly of women. They were very sensitive to that's what they were feeling, the pressure, social pressure and universal pressure to open up the country to women. If you tried to take a picture at a bus station, for instance, I would just raise the camera and see what the reaction would be of the guide. And if he started to get nervous or freak out, I knew it was going to be a rough week. But it got to the point where I couldn't guarantee to an editor in New York that I was going to come back with any pictures. A writer could continue to work and to talk to people. But for me, it's pretty obvious who I am carrying around 2-3 cameras, and difficult. But often I'd have to try to take a picture underneath my arm at the car, take a window seat, and autofocus or just manually focus and hope that something was in focus. But it really was a crapshoot. It was very difficult to predict how you could function. I do. I'm having the book translated into Farsi, and I'll deliver that to Kabul University as an electronic download for the university students. But after that, it's becoming more and more difficult security-wise to move around the country. The U.S. is no longer there with their helicopters. Public affairs officers are no longer there. You have to go through the Afghan military, and that's quite risky. I mean, it's still possible to work in the country, but I need to give it a little distance before I dive back in. Well, it's no longer ideological, it is for power. So I don't know what kind of groups are going to come in, how that's going to be mediated. I hope, at least from the United States point of view, that the governments remain engaged so the humanitarian organizations can continue to work there. But without security, a lot of the humanitarian groups are not going to be willing to participate. You can see what happens at numerous guest houses. They get surrounded by Taliban and killed. What UN group is going to want to go there? What Red Cross official is going to want to go there? What Save the Children person is going to want to go there? So everyone's fleeing. It's difficult to say, but it's a crucial transition period right now. A lot of it depends on what Pakistan wants to do.
Hi, you alluded to the terrain and the geography as a factor in this conflict. I wonder if you could just elaborate on that a bit more. I mean, do you see that as a bigger factor than maybe in other conflicts elsewhere?
Well, if you, and I've done this since I've done so many military embeds, this is at 5,000 feet. This is at zero, sea level. And you're walking around carrying 50 pounds of gear. This represents the challenge. Alexander the Great tried with elephants to come in through here. But when McChrystal and Petraeus came into rule at the Pentagon, they gave up all of the bases in this area of the Hindu Kush. They just can't be resupplied by helicopter. This is a beautiful day, but it's not always a beautiful, clear blue day to get a helicopter in, to get wounded out, or to get resupplies. So they've given up all of the small COPs. And obviously, when you give something up militarily, the enemy or the opposition comes back in. And there is this one nefarious group called Lashkar-e-Toiba, LET, which is they believe that they are the inheritors of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. They are taking up camps in this area. What do we do? It will take you 3 to 4 days to walk this region. You can't use a vehicle. You have to walk it. There is a road here, yes, but it's full of mines. I'm not really sure. I think the military now understands it, but in 2001, 2002, they didn't even know who Haqqani was.
You worked in some really difficult terrain and hot spots. What kind of situational awareness did you develop as a photographer and journalist?
Well, when I went home from Afghanistan, I had Kashmir to deal with, and if I went to Pakistan, I had Karachi to deal with, and they were in constant battles. Downtown, helicopters flying at rooftop level, trenches being dug in urban areas, no-go zones. Hindu-Muslim riots in India, I mean, I was surrounded by it. So there was very little relief, and the learning curve was pretty much vertical on how to deal with these as a foreigner. And if there were any locals willing to go with the crazy foreigner into these zones. But the best way to really summarize it is it depended upon my guide, my translator, and particularly my driver. those are your eyes and ears on the ground, which help you negotiate these particular conflicts. And you have to be able to know when to go in, when to leave, in particular when to leave. It's easy to get into one of these conflict zones. Work. The difficult part is getting out with your material. So yes, it's not for everybody. And what I'm concerned about today is that because foreign coverage has been curtailed due to budget and concern that no one's really interested anymore, foreign countries will no longer be on people's maps to go to and investigate and report from.
Did you have your material confiscated at times? Your pictures taken from you?
It's something a photographer never wants to admit. I did have some film taken from me in Bombay by some mad person who thought I took a picture of his wife in a swimming suit, but that's neither here nor there. It turns out he was in the diamond mafia and was quite sensitive. But I re-rolled film and put it away and put in a new roll very often if I thought things were getting dicey, or gave my film to somebody else. Remember, till 2001 we were shooting film. And digital came in after 9/11. So you had to take your card out and put in a new one and just hide your card. You tried whatever you could. I did have pretty good luck. In 2001, we had satellite phones maybe twice the size of these seats. They were not a lot of fun to carry around. And then things have gotten smaller. And what we have now is something called a BGAN, which is the size of a laptop. And they're very easy to use. Yes, we had to transmit.
Would you care to speak a little bit about the time from 1946 until the Russians came to Afghanistan? The state of affairs in
1946.
Between 1946, the partition time, 47 I should say, partition, when the British left, and the Russians arrived into Afghanistan. Was Afghanistan any different? Was it more stable? Did it have maybe 15, 20 years of relative peace?
Through the 70s, tourists were going on a limited basis, and I think the king or the royal family had to invite you. John Gunther went there in the 50s, but he had to be invited, the travel writers. And there was really no transport other than whatever you could bring in there yourself. There were some cars. But yes, I think there was peace during the monarchy. But it was a benign monarchy. He let the locals take care of their own things. He really didn't. They don't pay taxes. They don't pay homage to the central government. But things have obviously changed now. There's over 20 million people in Afghanistan. India and Pakistan are still obsessed with each other, particularly the Pakistanis more obsessed with India. India could really give a hoot about what, well, they care, but it's Pakistan's obsession. And using these proxy armies, religious groups, with Saudi funding, that is destabilizing the region, and now it's all blowback for them in Pakistan. The groups that they supported to hit India have now come back to attack them. And I'm not quite sure which direction Pakistan is going in. But after the British left, it's interesting, in this region in particular, everyone is blaming the other person or the other group or the other country for their problems. A lot of people have difficulty facing their own problems, governments. Pakistan is obsessed with India, and no politician in Pakistan can say we need to have better relations with India. India and Pakistan should be trading tea, sugar, wheat, salt, everything, but they're not. I mean, India gets a lot of their tea from Kenya, or it's insane when across the border they could be trading. And I think the business community needs to engage differently rather than the Pentagon, for instance. That would help. But again, the Pentagon has their eye on the area constantly with satellites, and the Brits are often blamed for the way they cut up their empire. It's hard to satisfy, it's hard to answer your question, but yes, Afghanistan did have a number of decades without fighting.
I think we have time for one final question.
Maybe the last question should be, William Dalrymple says that the whole history is repeating again and again. The present conflict and the first Afghan war are eerily similar. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, Willie Dalrymple has done a lot of studying, particularly in London, and gone back through soldiers' letters and diaries and historical manuscripts. I don't have that depth of knowledge. Willie doesn't spend a lot of time in Afghanistan. He spends it in libraries. And that's not a derisive comment, but that's just the way he functions, and he's a very good writer and very prolific. But yes, my biggest fear is that if we disengage from this region, the way the Soviets pulled out, and then the way the Americans closed their embassy, this vacuum will be filled by the dark side will come back. The potential is definitely there. History can repeat itself, and that's the warning that I really want to relay in the book of pictures. From when I first went in, the Soviets left. The Arabs who were fighting there never left.
On behalf of all of us here, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Mr. Nickelsberg's books are being sold right outside if you're interested in picking up a copy. Thank you very much for coming this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.